Hello class, my name is Caitlin Albert and I've decided to brief the case of Stahlecker versus Ford Motor Company. This case can be found in Chapter 7 on page 269 of our textbook. Now before I move on to all the details of this case, I want to discuss the fact that this case has a lot of criminal aspects to it. And usually when you look up the civil version, Stahlecker versus Ford Motor Company, you get a very brief gist of what that entails. And I thought that it would be of great benefit and kind of set this briefing apart from the others if we covered the criminal aspects first and then lead our way into the civil. So, it was August 28th of 2003 that Amy went to Omaha City to have dinner with her cousin and her friend Angela Dowling. Now, after dinner, the three decided to go to a bar where they had more drinks with their friends, had a good time, and around 1 o'clock in the morning, Angela and the cousin decided that they wanted to stay overnight in the city with their respective boyfriends. So, Angela let Amy borrow her 1997 white Ford Explorer that was equipped with Firestone AT radial tires in order for her to drive back to Fremont. And during that drive, one of the tires on the Ford Explorer experienced a defect. The defect was that the tread in the tire began to separate, and this essentially caused a blowout. This blowout left Amy stranded on a rural road at 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, I want to also cover that on that same day, two men, David Joy and one unnamed, happened to be canoeing on the Elkhorn River. One of the men had lost their wallets, and they decided to return to the river on August 29, 2003. This was when Amy's body was found on the bank of the Elkhorn River. After authorities were alerted and an investigation ensued, Amy's blood, smears and drops of it, were found on the bridge above, across the road, on the median, along with some scalp matter and the bracelet she had been wearing the day before. An autopsy was also done, and this autopsy revealed that not only was Amy physically and sexually assaulted, but gunshot wounds were the cause of her death. She had one to the back of the head, two to her face, one in her arm, and one in her hip. We're going to fast forward a couple days later on May 2nd of 2003. A man named Michael Hornbacher contacted investigators and told them that his friend, Richard Cook, had confessed to killing Amy Stahlecker. This led to Richard being questioned and a warrant obtained to search his truck. In the truck, they found traces of blood and clothing fibers that matched Amy's DNA and the clothing she had been wearing that night. Richard was then arrested and charged with first-degree murder. This wraps up the criminal portion of the case, and I will now be moving into the civil aspects. The civil aspects of the case include Amy's parents, Susan and Dale Stahlecker. They blamed Ford and Firestone for Amy's death, alleging that her encounter with Cook was a proximate cause of the defect in the tires. Approximate cause usually means a direct result. Negligence is a large part of this allegation on the grounds that both Ford and Firestone failed to design, manufacture, and adequately test and inspect their tires for the defect. Also, that both of them knew about the defect and failed to issue a recall or warn their customers. Smaller aspects of this case that I will briefly touch on include strict liability, breach of implied warranty, and res ipsa loquitur. Res ipsa loquitur basically means that the occurrence of an accident implies that there is negligence. Damages were also being sought for Amy's mental and physical suffering before the time of her death, and the loss of the relationship that she offered her parents, being that in the future she would support and care for them. The District Court of Nebraska sustained a demurrer, meaning that even though the evidence had a factual basis, it was irrelevant toward the main point against Ford and Firestone, and this caused them to dismiss the action. They had found that Cook's encounter with Amy was an intervening cause and not a proximate one. Also, that Ford and Firestone could not have foreseen it. So, the Stahleckers bypassed the Nebraska Court of Appeals and went straight to appealing to the Supreme Court of Nebraska. So what are the issues in this case? Was the criminal assault and murder of Amy Stahlecker a proximate cause of the tires failing? Or was the criminal act an effective intervening cause that cancels out any causal link? And now we've moved on to the analysis and ruling portion, or reasoning. So giving further background of a demurrer, it's the court's acceptance of all true facts and the reasonable inferences of law that may be drawn from them, but still finding them irrelevant and invalid. So even though it was held by the Supreme Court that the petition did allege sufficient facts of negligence for both placing defective products on the market, and that those defective products did cause Amy to become stranded in a rural area, it did not allege that any defending party had a legal duty to anticipate and guard against such criminal activity. And over here on the right side of the slide, you'll see that I've included some supporting facts that help with the court's ruling on this matter. Here we'll visit Rogier versus Good Samaritan Hospital. Now, brought by that case is a precedent set that in order to withstand a demurrer, the plaintiff needs to allege facts that are sufficient in constituting a cause of action. A cause of action is interpreted by the Supreme Court of Nebraska to mean a narrative of events, acts, and things done or omitted which show a legal liability of the defendant, in this case Ford and Firestone, to the plaintiff, the Stahleckers. Also, if we go over to McCarson versus McCarson and Malone versus American Bus Info, there's a precedent set that in determining whether a cause of action has been stated, a petition is to be construed liberally. If, as so construed, the petition states a cause of action, the demurrer is to be overruled. Moving forward, we're going to revisit the allegations of the Stahleckers once more in a little bit more detail. Ford and Firestone were negligent because they failed to manufacture tires with the ability to prevent the defect. They also failed to inspect and test the tires in an adequate manner, and they did not warn the customers about the defect or the risks that were posed by it, and that they knew of those risks and should have recalled the product. And now again, we'll visit the right-hand side of our slide. These are the supporting details of other cases that set precedents to help the court with their ruling on this particular case. So, in a product's liability action premised upon negligence, the issue is whether a manufacturer's conduct was reasonable in view of the foreseeable risk and injury. This comes from Kudlasek versus Fiat and Romig versus Mosley Machinery. And revisiting the Restatement Second of Torts, 395 at 325, 1965. A manufacturer who fails to exercise reasonable care in the manufacture of a chateau which, unless carefully made, he should recognize as involving an unreasonable risk of causing physical harm to those who use it for a purpose for which the manufacturer should expect it to be used, and to those whom he should expect to be endangered by its probable use. This is subject to liability for physical harm caused to them by its lawful use in a manner and for a purpose for which it is supplied. Some of the cases that either set this forward or used it was Accord Morris versus Chrysler Corp, and Rose versus Buffalo Air Service, and Hancock versus Picard Inc. And looking at Freeman versus Hoffman LaRoche, the court recognized that the manufacturer or seller does have a legal duty to warn about a risk or hazard inherent in the way a product is designed that is related to the intended uses as well as the reasonably foreseeable uses that may be made of the products. And now we'll go over the 3 requirements for approximate cause. The first being the but-for rule. And this is basically that the injury would not have happened but for the cause. Number 2, the injury is a natural and probable result of the negligence. And number 3, there was no intervening cause. Now, with the Stahleckers petition, it only meets the first requirement, that Amy would not have been stranded but for the tire failure, and therefore she would not have been assaulted and murdered. But the other 2 elements become a little connected, because Cook breaks that causal link between the injury and the original act of the manufacturers by being an intervening cause. And now if we look at the second Restatement of Torts, 448 at 480-1965, the act of a third person in committing an intentional tort or crime is a superseding cause of harm to another resulting therefrom. Although the actor's negligent conduct created a situation which afforded an opportunity to the third person to commit such a tort or crime, unless the actor at the time of his negligent conduct realized or should have realized the likelihood that such a situation might be created and that a third person might avail himself of the opportunity to commit such a tort or crime. So one of the things about the Stahlecker versus Ford Motor Company case is when you look up the case briefing, either in the textbook or in a lot of other locations, you'll find that it usually references a case called Sharkey versus Board of Regents. Now, I decided not to use that case in my case brief because, again, I wanted to set myself apart, but wanted to make sure that I had a case that sufficiently held the same standard. So with that being said, I'm going to move on to going over Zeller versus County of Howard. Now, in the Zeller versus County of Howard case, there was a husband and wife, George and Dorothy Zeller, that were driving on a county road to visit their daughter. Now with them, they had filled their truck bed with a bunch of grass clippings and were driving a little slow for the speed limit, 50 miles per hour and a 50 mile per hour zone to be exact. On their drive, they encountered a blind intersection, basically meaning that as they were traveling northbound straightways, the perpendicular road was coming uphill and into the intersection. Now, not stopping or slowing down, George drove through the intersection, and from the east, they were hit by another car. Both sustained injuries, but George unfortunately died of his. Dorothy sued the County of Howard on the basis that there should have been a stop sign at the intersection, and it actually turns out that there had been one, but it was taken down by vandals, which was reported to the county 2 months prior to the Zeller accident. And Dorothy alleged that George's death was a direct result of the county's failure to replace that stop sign. Now, what the court actually found is that the county had no duty to install, maintain, or replace that stop sign. And because of the nature of the blind intersection, it's actually the driver's responsibility to use caution and reasonable care in such a scenario. So, George's death is not a direct result of the county's negligence, but his own as a driver, because with or without a stop sign, his view was still obstructed and he needed to use reasonable care. Also, the county could not be bound to anticipate or contemplate his unreasonable disregard for such a danger, and therefore his driving conduct was unforeseeable and became an intervening cause. So concluding the Stahlecker versus Ford Motor Company case, the sustained demurrer and the dismissed action were not to be found in error. Reiterating, the petition did contain facts that found Ford and Firestone negligent in placing those defective products on the market, which in turn did cause Amy to become stranded, but there were no facts that give Ford and Firestone a duty to foresee and protect from any criminal actions committed by a third party who had complete control of the situation. And therefore, is an intervening cause, not a proximate one. Chapter 7 of our textbook goes over negligence a lot. And to me, this case was very important to that. Actually, both referenced were. And that reason being that they hold a very heavy emotional aspect to them. And it kind of goes to show that whether it be in this chapter, in this course, in the future, in the courts, that the law needs to have the ability to be cold and take that step back from emotion to give hard rulings like this. And that keeps the justice system fair. So just like someone in actual courts or in an actual business trying to foresee any risks that you may come across, you need to be able to have that emotional separation, because emotions can cloud the judgment of a fair ruling. And for those reasons, that's why I chose to brief this case. I wanted to research it further. I wanted to see the emotional side, which comes up in criminal cases, and I wanted to see the cold side in the civil world, how it could be analyzed, and agree with the ruling. So if you take a look at my last slide, this is all of the sources that I used to put together my Writing to paper, my PowerPoint, and this presentation. Feel free to visit any of those links if you'd like any further information that you feel I may not have covered. Thank you so much for your time.